We have one more speaker today for session 4, Shane Wellendorf. Hello. And he will be presenting on land conservation in the Red Hills, the Aucilla River watershed and beyond, a win for people, natural resources, and archaeology. And here is Sean, and here is his presentation.
Well, welcome. It's an honor to be here. Thank you to the Aucilla Research Institute to give Toll Timbers an opportunity to share a little bit about what we do. It's an honor to follow the previous speakers. Just an amazing amount of research and amazing things that we have going on in and around North Florida and the other places as well. I want to talk to you a little bit about private land conservation. It's a little bit different than what you've heard earlier today, but I think that you're going to see that private land conservation and conservation easements are a tool that can help protect and conserve the things that we love, whether that's natural resources, whether that's ecosystems, archaeological sites, historical resources. This is something that can be used to keep those things available for us to enjoy and study for a long time. So Tall Timbers Research Station and Land Conservancy has been around since 1958. Many people know us for our ecological research, particularly prescribed fire. We are the home of prescribed fire research. It started right here in North Florida in the Red Hills region. We're also known for doing a lot of great wildlife research. Many people know us for quail, but we also do a lot of non-game work as well. We're a land trust. We've been doing that since 1991, and we hold conservation easements all throughout South Florida and North Georgia. And we're a landowner. We have a property over in Leon County. It's about 3,900 acres, and then another property as well in Jefferson County here that's 9,100 acres. And this is an opportunity for us to do a place to do our research and really to put to practice the things that we preach. So Tall Timbers, like I said, is a 3,900 acre historic hunting property. It was first managed as a hunting property since about 1890. We are listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and like I said, we're the home of prescribed fire research. And if you ever want a taste of history, consider reading Memoirs of a Naturalist by Herbert Stoddard. He really was the leader in the region in the early 1920s and has a huge impact, had a huge impact on the ecology and the land management that's gone on in the Red Hills since his time. The other thing I will mention is that if you come to Tall Timbers and you go out on our properties, you're going to see these open pine savannas, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Our other property, Livingston Place, many of you probably know it as Dixie Plantation, is 9,125 acres. It's also listed on the National Register for Historic Places, just happened. And we're ecstatic about that, and it was listed for a variety of reasons in a whole spectrum of architectural property or structures that are out there. One of them is the main house that was designed by John Russell Pope, but we also have some pretty amazing tenant houses as well that are being maintained. And again, we're focusing our efforts and our land management there on our wildlife research and also on actively doing forestry and agriculture. And Livingston Place is protected with a conservation easement held by the Suwannee River Water Management District. So not only does Tall Timbers hold conservation easements, but we are also a conservation easement landowner. So Tall Timbers and Livingston Place, and really all along the Florida-Georgia line between Tallahassee and Thomasville is known as this Red Hills region. And for the last 100 years, its primary land use has been wild quail hunting. It is a place that have these large hunting estates, and really since Stoddard's time, 1920s, they've been actively managing these large estates with prescribed fire, which has kept many of these properties and a lot of our lands in phenomenal ecological shape, and we've got diverse wildlife to show for that because of that great land management. This is a map that Stoddard made from the early 1920s. Like many of you, I love old maps. And you can see, here's the Florida-Georgia line. Here's Tall Timbers, Tallahassee, Thomasville, Georgia up here. And in this region then would have been these large hunting estates. If you drive up US Highway 319 or Highway 19 for that matter, you will see those old hunting estates as you go along. And again, like I said, this is 1920s. Notice how the portion of the Red Hills over here northeast of Monticello isn't on this map yet because they weren't hunting properties yet. This is a modern view of the Red Hills, and again, you can see the Florida-Georgia line. Here's Tall Timbers, here's Livingston Place. Everything that you see in tan here are these hunting properties. So since the early 1900s, when these hunting properties were started, till now, we have more acres that are being managed as these hunting estates now than we did back then, a little over 400,000 acres. So you can see that this Red Hills region between Tallahassee and Thomasville is primarily in these large hunting properties. I also want to highlight the watersheds. We've heard a lot about the Aucilla just a minute ago. You can see that this is this line here, and then this other purple line here is the St. Mark's watershed. This area of the Red Hills, those tan properties, in addition to these watersheds, are where Tall Timbers really focuses its efforts, especially its conservation efforts. Many of you know Peter Kleinhens and Tyler McMillan. They've been wandering around today. They are dedicated to land conservation work in the Aucilla watershed. And so this gives you a sample of this region that Tall Timbers is focusing our conservation efforts on. So I want to give you a little perspective of the ecological side of things, what Tall Timbers is interested in. I'm a wildlife biologist by training. These are the things that I'm most passionate about, and I think Peter as well. What you find when you come throughout the Red Hills and what we're trying to conserve are these open pine forests. These are unique forests. These are forests that are being managed with frequent prescribed fire that's being conducted every 1 to 3 years. You've got this open pine canopy, but this very diverse understory. Underneath the understory is where the wildlife are of interest. This is where your quail, Bachman sparrows, and all these other critters, gopher tortoises and others that we're interested in. We're also interested in wetlands, and the Red Hills is blessed with phenomenal wetlands and river corridors, whether you're looking at the shoreline of Lake Miccosukee or sections of the Aucilla River. These are really phenomenal things. And not only do wetlands have phenomenal wildlife diversity, but it is the key to protecting our water resources. And when you protect wetlands, you're protecting our water. We often, when we talk about conservation, our minds go to those pretty places of open pine forests and river swamps. But the reality is that conservation easements also include working lands. They include places for harvesting timber and for growing our crops. I mean, we all need to eat and we all need to have wood for construction, and so we recognize that. I think the key that Tall Timbers tries to do is balance good land conservation in those high priority natural areas, but then allows for sustainable agriculture and forest production. And as you saw on the map just a little bit ago, a huge portion of our North Florida, South Georgia region is privately owned. I mean, we're blessed with great public lands in and around the Apalachicola National Forest, but the reality is that the majority of our lands are in private hands. And we've got to recognize that these private lands are critical for managing wildlife, maintaining plant diversity, it's for protecting water resources, groundwater recharge, et cetera. Additionally, these are places where we have most of our historic and archaeological sites are going to be on private lands. So when we have private lands of interest for conservation, the main tool that Toll Timbers is using, and other land trusts, and this goes for land trusts anywhere in the United States or in other parts of Florida as well, but we are primarily using a conservation easement. And a conservation easement is a legal agreement between a land trust and a landowner. It's a modified deed. And a landowner is giving up a portion of his land rights, not all of them, but a portion of them. And typically those are the rights that are associated with the ability to develop that property, to convert it to more intensive land uses, and to limit subdivision. So this is keeping rural lands essentially in a rural land use. With a conservation easement, landowner still owns it. He still manages it, he can use it, he can love it. The conservation easement does not grant public access, but it does make sure that those conservation features on the property remain intact or are managed in a sustainable way. Here's the key with conservation easements. They run with the land. So as the property transitions from one owner to the next, the conservation easement comes right along with it. This is valuable. You're talking about doing surveys 4 and 5 generations down the line. Conservation easement's going to ensure that that property is going to be maintained and protected to allow for that future research. So, you know, this is a big commitment. I mean, you're giving up a portion of your land rights to a land trust. It takes a special landowner, a special individual to do that. But we find that landowners that are passionate about their property, they've put in blood, sweat, and tears into that land, or that it's been in their family for multiple generations, those are the ones where a conservation easement could be a good fit. They need to be willing to have a partner in that land ownership. It's absolutely critical. You cannot leave a conservation easement very easily. It is easier to divorce your spouse than it is to get out of your conservation easement. So it's a big decision that needs to be considered carefully. And to help incentivize this, because it is such a big deal, there are tax incentives. And I'm not going to go into this just to keep things moving along. The key is that there are significant federal tax benefits and state tax benefits for doing so. The perspective is that by doing conservation easements on private lands, whether it's state government, federal government, they can gain conservation values for the public. These are indirect conservation values, but they are values that are important to all of us. Oftentimes they're referred to the conservation purposes of the conservation easement. Most of the time they do not include public use. It can be an option. Options 2, 3, and 4 are what Toll Timbers does the most, and these are working on conservation of relatively natural habitats for wildlife, open spaces for forest and ag land, and then protecting historical resources. Many of you have probably driven by this property many times. It's on US Highway 19, right on the Florida-Georgia line, and this is a board member of ours, George Watkins, and his wife Cindy. They've protected their entirety of their property. They love this tract. They've protected for these these massive longleaf and Ward's Creek. By putting in this land in conservation easement, they're allowed to do some timbering, but they have set it up so that these large longleaf can remain, and they've given up all commercial timber harvesting rights in Wards Creek to keep that habitat intact and to protect those water resources. So it's quite a commitment, but for them, it was the right decision because of their love of the land and their interest in giving to the community that way. So we're back to our Red Hills map. Again, you've got the Florida-Georgia line coming across, Tall Timbers on the west, Livingston Place in the east. Everything that you see in green is permanently conserved. Other than this dark green, which would be your national forest and your state lands down on the coast, everything that are in these lighter colors of green are privately owned lands that are permanently protected, almost all of them through conservation easements. We're a little over 180,000 acres that is permanently protected. We're to the point now in the Red Hills that we're pushing about 40% that's permanently protected. We've got enough lands where the things that we're passionate about, pine savannas, wildlife species, the use of prescribed fire can remain because we're going to have large enough tracts that are permanently protected. So, I'm a biologist by training. My passion is birds and trees, but conservation easements are also a great tool for protecting historical resources and archaeological sites. And those historical resources can be very critical for us when we're developing conservation easements to be used as one of those conservation purposes. Sometimes it's the primary reason, sometimes it's an additional or secondary reason. But historical resources can be a critical component to a conservation easement. This is an example of a historical resource-oriented conservation easement that Tall Timbers has done. This is over in Leon County. This is a conservation easement that was about 122 acres, but it included the original home site of the Bannerman Plantation, which at one time was over 1,500 acres. This was a property that had great natural resources, protecting riverine systems and planted pines and pine savanna, but also had the original Bannerman House and additional outbuildings. And the conservation easement, like almost all conservation easements, limited subdivision, limited development, limited conversion of land use, but also layered in additional protections for the house. This was a conservation easement where that historical resource was the primary conservation purpose that we used to justify the conservation easement. We were able to do that because we had an existing archaeological and architectural study that was done before the conservation easement. It's really important to have those studies done, so we have that documentation to show that there is real value there. And the property is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. What's interesting about this conservation easement is that not only does it protect the land, but it has layers of protection in there for the house. It's intended to keep the house essentially maintained in its current structural condition, with some flexibility in there, of course, and that any future work on the exterior of the house would go through Secretary of Interior standards for rehabilitation. So through this conservation easement, we're ensuring that this historical resource, this house, is going to be maintained and protected and preserved. So as you can imagine, as the landowner that put this conservation easement in, who did a bunch of restoration work on this house to get it into its current shape, this is an assurance that this house will remain that historical resource that it is. Another one, which is actually pretty close to this one in Lake Ammonia, over in Leon County, is an island. It's a 33-acre island, but no surprise to many of you, this island has had extensive Native American use over lots of years. And there was an archaeological study that was done, and they found an amazing amount of artifacts on this island, and the landowner wanted to protect this island mainly to ensure that those archaeological resources would be protected in the future. So we structured this conservation easement a little bit differently in that we put in these special zones that are there to protect those high quality or those places where there is a high amount of volume of artifacts there. And so any future disturbances, any future significant work that's done there needs approval of the landowner and the land trust. So this is an opportunity to have this third party, a land trust like Tall Timbers, to be able to provide guidance to, and not in necessarily the study part of it, but just to ensure that those archaeological resources are being protected in such a way that's going to allow for future excavation and future scientific and educational use. And again, this, regardless of the landowner, this conservation easement is in place to ensure for future excavations. So I do want to shift gears a little bit because, and talk a little bit about Florida Forever. And for us in the land conservation business, Florida Forever is a phenomenal opportunity to get land conservation done. It's Florida's land buying program for conservation, and they can have a pretty big checkbook. Last year, they were given $400 million to buy conservation land throughout the state of Florida, which is pretty amazing. And they have a pretty good track record of getting somewhere between 60 and 100 million pretty regularly. So the Florida Department of Environmental Protection oversees Florida Forever, and they've developed this extensive list of different goals that they use to rank projects. And notice goal F is dealing specifically to preserve significant archaeological and historical sites. And they're doing that by going to that master site file record, which is Florida's official record for archaeological and historical sites. I'm sure many of you have submitted numerous records to it and are very familiar with it. But it's extremely important. In 2019, we worked with the Gem Land Company, who own multiple tracts in the Red Hills. Many of you have been around Lake Miccosukee, you're familiar with their properties, Norris, Ring Oak, and they also own one in Leon County, Cherokee. All of these lands were submitted to the Florida Forever for potential funding for conservation easements. When we developed this application, which goes through a full review by the Acquisition Restoration Council, we were able to find 13 historical records in the master site file, which is phenomenal. It really allowed for us to highlight and emphasize the importance of these properties, not only from a conservation perspective, but also from a historical resources perspective. Because of its many high qualities, including its historical resources, when it came to ranking this project, the Red Hills Conservation Project or this Gem Land Company project, it ranked number 5 amongst all the other conservation easement projects. And getting a high rank is really important. There's, not only are there conservation easements that are being bought, but there's also state parks and other fee acquisitions that are being done. Currently, there's 125 projects on that Florida Forever list. So the stronger case that you can make that you can meet lots of those goals, the better case you are for getting funding. So having lots of records on the master site file is just really critical for ours. The other thing that I didn't really highlight, but that Tall Timbers does is we are very much into land planning and land advocacy. We have a land planner, regional planner at Tall Timbers. His name's Neil Fleckenstein. Many of you know him well. And Neil helps to keep the Red Hills, and try to limit significant changes to our land use and to try to limit major infrastructure projects that can have huge impacts. And for those of you that live in and around Jefferson County, this came to roost to us a few years ago with MCORS, which was a toll road that was going to come from South Florida and end in Jefferson County. And so with the help of the Aucilla Research Institute and Tall Timbers and others, we worked to get additional records on the master site file. And having those records added to that master site file was one of the many tools that were used to help essentially stop that toll road from coming to Jefferson County. This is a map of our region. Again, you got Tallahassee here and Monticello. There's the Florida-Georgia line. All these dots, these are all of our master site file records for this region. It's over 9,000 records. So when a major infrastructure project is coming to our region and it's getting federal funds, they must pull these records and do a review of what historical resources may be in front of this major infrastructure project that they are considering. It's not going to stop a toll road, but it is definitely a speed bump. And when you see something like this from an engineer's perspective or for somebody making a road plan, this is going to make you stop and think. And so by getting these things into the record, it helps us to make that case for regional planning and for land conservation. So I applaud all of your efforts to getting things into the master site file. So let me just wrap things up, and then we can go get some supper and a cold drink. The bulk of the land out there is private land, and we've got amazing landowners that are interested in land conservation. They're interested in archaeology, historical resources, and they're willing to put conservation easements on those tracts. And really and truly, most of the time, it's a way to ensure that we're going to get those conservation values protected, but keep the land in private ownership and in private management, which is the best scenario for everybody. And so conservation easements just are a phenomenal tool to do that. Your work for archaeology, for historical resources is critical for our work when we try to justify conservation easements. And keep in mind that conservation easements can be a way to provide additional protections for those really special archaeological sites. And just keep continuing to add those things to the master site file because it all matters. So thank you.
Okay. Jill, do we have a little time for some questions? About 3 minutes. Hey, Shane, in 3 minutes.
Okay.
Anybody have questions? In the front. Oh. Okay.
Is it on? I was wondering if the prehistoric people and the indigenous people in the historic period, if they were doing managing the land with burning as well, systematically.
Yeah, I'm far from the expert, but we know that Native Americans had a very influential role in lighting fires across this landscape. We had lightning strike fires, but our Native Americans were regularly using fire to manage the land.
Yeah,
so.
I thought that they might be. I just didn't know if you had good historic records for it or oral tradition tapped into that, just to learn from things rather than reinventing the wheel, essentially.
Yeah, there's various documentation out there for sure, and our fire scientists at Tall Timbers you know, that it's something that they're interested in as well.
I had one other question. I noticed on the slide when it said that the artifacts found on properties stayed with the family, but people were allowed to study them. When the land goes to a new owner, do those artifacts go to the new owner? I wasn't clear on the slide what happened to the artifacts.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if I have a good answer for you. I think that they do run with that land. I think that the land trust is the entity that would help to serve as that bridge between those landowners and making sure that those artifacts stay as part of that site and that record.
So that's part of, say, a negotiation between your organization and the landowner, how that gets defined for a particular property?
That's correct. We could negotiate that differently. For this particular landowner, that's what they wanted.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Lonnie Mann, do organizations that manage conservation easements have any obligation to be transparent? Any legal obligation to be transparent? For example, I corresponded with a company up in New England that was managing some land here about archaeological resources, and they were not particularly forthcoming. I mean, it was I don't know if you've ever heard of the outfit or not, but is there any obligation or expectation for these entities to be transparent?
Well, you know, conservation easements are a publicly recorded document. So those, you go to the public record and you could pull that conservation easement and read exactly what the terms and provisions are. Our easement documentation reports, all of those components that are part of a conservation easement project, those are held back at Tall Timbers. We will release them with the approval of the landowner, but they are not necessarily a public document. So you know, what's publicly available is always available, and then those other things, it just depends.
Okay, so easements were set up for archaeological purposes. When development begins near to those easements, does the entity have any obligation for monitoring?
So we, as a land trust, we do have an obligation for monitoring, and at a minimum, we're there at least once a year to make sure that those terms and conditions of that easement are being maintained. On an example like that, where you may have a pending threat to a site, we're going to be right there on a regular basis to ensure that those conservation values are protected.
That's really just your particular practice, right? It's not any sort of legal obligation.
We are legally obligated, actually, through the IRS as a nonprofit that is qualified to do conservation easements to do regular monitoring. The annual monitoring comes from the fact that we're an accredited land trust, and accreditation standards are annual monitoring at a minimum. So that's the.
Thank you.
Sure.
So are conservation easements generally off limits to the general public, or are there some that have hiking trails and open it up to public?
Yeah, that's a great question. Most of the time, they're off limits to the public, or that there's no rights granted for public access as part of that conservation easement. We have a few exceptions where a landowner had we have one landowner who had a historic house that wanted the opportunity to have the public visit it 1 or 2 times a year, where they would open up the property. But generally, that's not the case. But you can structure a conservation easement that does allow for public use. And other land trusts do that. That's just not something we've done at Tall Timbers.
Okay, if there aren't any other questions for Shane, this is it for today until 7:15.